Frank and Emma were desperate. Their daughter, aged 14, was missing. They were out in the woods desperately searching for her. Storm clouds were coming overhead and she was only lightly dressed. They needed to find her, and they needed to find her fast. People were out there looking for her, they were sure. But these weren't nice people. There were various groups hunting. Some were monster hunters who had decided that Emma was a creature that they had to catch. Others were monsters themselves who wanted to make Emma one of their own. All Frank and Jane knew was they had to find her and save her. They trekked on through the trees, feeling, despite the leaves, the heavy rain starts to find its way across, through, and small splats down onto their face. The wind started to build up in the distance, howling through the trees, making it harder to hear. But despite that, they thought they could hear screams in the distance. They were nervous, they were panicking. It was their little girl. They had to save her. They had to get to her. Off to one side, they thought they heard a gunshot and started heading in that direction. But as they ran, the trees seemed to be grabbing at them, breaking off their faces, pulling at their clothes, but still they forced their way on. The wind howled, and there almost seemed to be the start of some kind of whirlwind or tornado in the middle of the forest. They'd never been in this forest before. They'd only stopped in the town briefly, going through, moving from the east coast to the west coast for work. But then it had happened. They'd been in their room in the motel when they'd heard a noise, and when they'd gone, they'd found the room that Emma was supposed to be in empty and the window open. She didn't know why Emma had gone to start. Then they realised that Emma's door was open because the lock was broken. Someone had kicked it open and Emma had escaped out of the window. Now they were chasing. They'd seen prints heading into the woods and they had to find their little girl. What would any parent do if their child was missing, potentially chased? They knew that this town was renowned for having dark powers. They knew this town was renowned for having monsters that lived here, of various varieties. Vampires, werewolves, and all. Of course, not all monsters were bad, but enough were that they were scared if someone else picked up the scent. So they, without pausing, had headed off and run straight into the woods where they were now. They were still lightly dressed. They weren't ready for wet weather. They weren't ready for a storm. But then probably, nor was Emma. Running, they continued. Through the trees, the light was dark, almost unnaturally dark, and there was a scent to the wind as it hurled past their ears and whipped them in the face, bringing up debris from the grounds, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. They continue going, but still, it was getting harder and harder. They didn't know what was in the middle, but they knew it wasn't good. There was lightning now starting to wrap round just in the centre area, and as they came into a brief clearing and looked up, they could see the giant cone of a tornado heading into the sky. Lightning and thunder booming, little bits of lightning seeming to whip around and through the tornado. But unusually, the cone was stagnant, sat directly in the middle of these woods, and the direction they knew they had to head. Looking one last time, they saw it had a purple haze, almost interweaving through the dark clouds, and wondered what that was, but cast the thought off and continued going. Another gunshot made them wonder what was happening, and rather heading towards the centre, they veered in that direction. Could hunters be targeting their Emma? They knew they were there. They knew well that they might be targeted. They were new in town, even if they weren't staying. So still they ran. The rain got heavier, drenching them to the bone. A chill added to the breeze, making them shiver. But their minds could think of nothing but their poor daughter. While they were searching, further out, some hunters had headed into the woods. They knew there were creatures out tonight. This storm wasn't natural. They didn't know whether it was creatures or whether it was linked to those strangers that had come into town. But they didn't care. If they caught a human, they could still sell it. They moved, cautiously, expertly, carefully moving from tree to tree, staying in the dark, staying in the shadows, hearing screams ahead, as well as the howl of the wind. There was plenty to cover them, plenty to stop anyone knowing they were there before it was too late. They carried bulky rifles, designed for elephants, but they should be powerful enough to take out whatever creatures they came up against. They smiled at each other, missing teeth and stubble as they went through. These were not nice people. These were not nice men. They didn't care about anyone but themselves and what they could get from their latest hunt. Elsewhere in the forest, the creatures lurked, bounding through. This was their weather. This was their night. They were on the hunt. There were people out here. They could smell it. Lunch. They would find them. They would devour them. And they would take their power. They revelled in the rain and the wind. They could feel the power coming off the portal they knew was in the centre of the woods, in the old stone circle that the cone was going to. The portal was opening, and who knows what power or what else may come from that. Bounding, howling, laughing, they caught a smell. Not realising it was too late, they heard a boom as a large rifle went off, catching one of them in the side, sending it sprawling, smacking against a tree. It rolled, bounded back up, then started to shake as the silver in the round did its vile work, burning through the body and slowly and painfully killing the creature. The other creatures drew back their teeth and growled, then ran in different directions, disappearing into the dark. The hunters looked round with their rifle, suddenly realising there had been more of them than they thought, and that they may be in trouble. One was quickly reloading with more of their heavy rounds. But they had one. Maybe they could get some parts. Maybe they would leave now. They moved up as the creature's body slowly started to change and twist and turn, until in the end all that was left lying there was the naked form of a little old lady. Looking down with horror, they knew there was nothing they could get from that. The old lady was the lady that ran the local hardware store. They'd never even thought that she could be one of them. She was too kind and too sweet. Well, she wasn't now. They continued moving on. They needed a creature that wasn't going to turn back or to capture one. Then they would have something to sell. Or again, maybe they'd forget the creatures. Maybe if they could find the little girl whose door they'd kicked in, she should sell well. There was a good market for children. Frank and Jane were frantic at this point. They'd heard the booms, they'd heard the screams, and as they walked through, heading in that direction, they stopped, looking down to their horror at the naked body, a huge wound in its shoulder, of the little old lady that they'd bought a pack of sweets from earlier. Shaking their head, not allowing the fear to get to them, they ploughed on, rechanging their direction and heading for the centre, praying that Emma would have the sense to go that way. The monsters had scattered. They'd lost one of their own. But revenge would be had. There were several smells they could smell. They could smell the fetid stench of the hunters. They could smell a cleaner, older scent of Frank and Jane. And then there was the sweet, young smell of a child. That would be good meat. That would taste wonderful. There were only two of them now, but they turned and headed, thinking everyone would be heading towards the centre, towards the portal. And maybe when they got there, it would give them the power they needed to overcome the hunters, and they could feast. The hunters were moving. The wind was going. They'd hunkered down and crouched, knowing just how dangerous this was. They had to find the girl, but avoid everybody else. Then again, if they could capture one of the creatures, they had some silver binds. That would be an incredibly valuable haul. So, they moved on, step at a time. Emma was in wild panic. Something had kicked in her door. She'd run into the woods, and now she was just running. Her feet hurt. They were bare. She was only in her pyjamas. The rain was coming down, and her pyjamas were stuck to her. She didn't know how to get back. She didn't know where she was, but she could sense power ahead of her. There was power coming from the centre, so she ran that way. She didn't know why. She didn't know what was happening, but she had to get there. She knew that much. Her destiny, her salvation was in that direction. A boom and a scream off to one side. Weird smells, the howling of the wind. Her face stung where branches had smacked against it. Her blonde hair floating behind her in the wind. But still, she pressed on. Terror had taken her mind, and all she could think of, all she could focus on, was going forward, getting towards the centre. As Frank and Jane moved forward, they could sense they were getting closer. There was a snap off to one side, and they looked, and suddenly a large, giant creature lurched up ahead of them. It was part humanoid, part squirrel. That was the only thing they could think in shock. There was a giant bushy tail. There were the weird ears. The face was slightly distorted. It smiled at them, but the smile was not reassuring. Then turned and ran faster than they could go towards the centre. In the middle, Emma was backed up against the tree, two of the creatures approaching her, salivating from their giant maws, dripping from their overgrown teeth as they looked, their furry horror, large claws. They stepped forward. Lunch. Suddenly, one of them was smashed to one side as another strange creature ran into it, its tail bobbing behind it, its ears flicking to pick up all of the sound as it batted the creature away with the crunch, and the two of them rolled, fighting tooth and claw, into the woods. Emma looked at the remaining one, but now she had to root out, span round the tree, and ran for her life. A boom came, and the creature that was following her disappeared in a spray. But that left her no less relieved as she turned round and saw the tooth missing, ugly, unclean faces of the hunters as they stalked towards her. "Come to us, little girl. You'll be safe. We'll make sure you're safe." She turned and ran. She had to get to the centre. She didn't know where her parents were. She didn't know what was going on, but the centre was safety. She was sure of it. The winds got stronger and there were booms in the trees as lightning struck. Fire struck up in various places and smoke started to spread throughout the trees, making it harder to see and harder to breathe, but still she ran. As the fire came, Frank and Jane had no idea what to do. The fire was spreading despite the storm, but the rain should be holding it back. How could fire grow in such rain and such conditions? But the wind was fanning it. Again, they looked towards where they had seen the clearing in the centre. Perhaps there lay safety. That was perhaps the only point. And they ran as fast as they could. In the centre, the swirling vortex had torn a hole in reality, and there was a black globe spinning, blacker than the eye could make out, absorbing light to the point that nothing existed besides silver points of lightning spreading round the outside. Emma got inside and stopped. The portal was there, but she daren't go through it. She didn't know what was there, but she could feel something from it calling to her. She turned round. The hunters were stalking through, coming their way. She backed up, not realizing that her back had hit one of the stones from the stone circle surrounding the portal, and her body started to vibrate. Frank and Jane ran on, seeing the clearing open. They worked. There was a boom, and Jane screamed, thinking what was happening. Then there were screams and cries, and a ferocious roar, more than she'd ever heard before. As they got in, they looked on with horror. Emma was stood there, looking down at the bodies of the two hunters. Their chests removed, their hearts had been ripped out, and there was blood round her mouth as she looked up at them and smiled, with the relief of knowing all was good. Her parents were here now. How was that? I thought I'd make it a bit different because there wasn't that much going on in the main story, but by getting it from different points of view, mix things up a bit. So a bit different to the usual one. What do people think? And you got Nutkins. And he saved somebody. Even if he was aware, Nutkins. Glad you enjoyed it. We'll see how I do for Wednesday. Keep an eye on it. It's currently up and scheduled. If I can't do it, I will take the scheduled episode down and remove it. I will also post in Discord and post in the YouTube community. Tootie, did you see? I'll try and see what I can do for that later. Did you see my comment for you in the community on YouTube that the episode I've just edited for the current one has giant blind albino penguins? So that said, anyone that's got to this point, thank you for watching all the way through. Please like, subscribe, click the bell and notifications, because YouTube likes controlling what recommendations you get, and it tries to give you the recommendations for the larger content creators, which makes it very hard for those of us that are smaller to actually get out there. So likes, comments will help, but if you want to watch, make sure you subscribe and select all notifications. As I said, Patreon, we are gradually crawling closer. We were at 2,857 view hours of the 3,000 we need for YouTube memberships and some other bits and pieces. So we're nearly there. So anyone who watches more and subscribes, that would be greatly appreciated. It all helps. And with that said, I'm going to say farewell for now and see you in the next one.